Welcome to the second to last Bevan Series lecture of the quarter. For those who don't know me, I'm Daniel Schindler. I'm a faculty here in SAFS. And this is the second of two discussions we've had about seafood certification. Last week we heard from Rupert House from MSC, and today we'll hear from John Garner from right here in Seattle about an alternative perspective from what we heard last week. Very brief bio for our speaker today. John was born and raised in Alaska, homeschooled, sent off to boarding school, the real Alaska experience. He continued that, entering the fishing industry as a fisherman, and based on his bio, I think he's fished in most of the major fisheries in Alaska, from crab to salmon to herring, a whole bunch of different. No pollock, okay. No pollock, all the land-based ones at least. Did that for a couple decades. During that time, he also came down to Seattle, got a Bachelor of Arts at Seattle University, and then returned to UW and got a law degree here. And one of the interesting aspects of his career was getting in at ground zero with Alaska's Commercial Fishery Entry Commission, which has been widely regarded as one of the first examples of limited entry in the whole world, and Alaska really led the charge there. John Garner was really in at ground zero and helping develop that one. More recently, he was held several positions with Trident Seafoods here in Seattle, running their salmon program for a while, and then sales rep or something. Something business related that I have no appreciation for.
I didn't do very well. I'm not with it anymore.
And he's now, since 2014, is the Chief Operating Officer of North Pacific Seafoods here in Seattle. And John's going to give us his perspective on the certification issue from the perspective of his experience as both a fisherman and more recently as someone involved in the fishing industry. So please welcome John Garner.
Just a moment. Okay. Can everybody hear me? I'm sorry about that. It's a beautiful day outside. What in the world would you want to come and to listen to me talk about sustainability for? It's an interesting topic. It's a complicated one, and I think I've got a different perspective than most people in the room, and certainly many people in the non-industry side of things. I'd want to start by saying that these opinions are mine. They're not the company that I work for, and so to the extent that they're offensive or wrong, I apologize, but not for them. It's not them doing it. I want to give a little bit more of my background just to provide a little bit of perspective on how I came to the conclusions that I've come to in my time. It might help explain my interest in the question that I pose for today, which is, who do we want to regulate our fisheries? Do we want it to be governments, or do we want it to be NGO groups bringing pressure on fishery regulators? As mentioned, I was born in Ketchikan, Alaska. Alaska was still a territory then. My father was a commercial fisherman. His father was a commercial fisherman. My mother worked in salmon processing plants in the summer. We were a fishing family, along with a bunch of other things. You do some mining, you do some logging. In my father's case, he worked for the dew-line system. During this time, Alaska salmon fisheries were regulated by the federal government. Regulations were generally set before the salmon returned. The harvest was usually on a set schedule, preordained, regardless of what the actual run strength was that occurred. Because of that type of fishing regime and other factors, over time, salmon runs declined. And when there's no fish, boats start to look like that. They can't go fishing. I fished my first season when I was a young teenager with a boat that I salvaged off the beach, little skiff, and began fishing for salmon near Cordova, Alaska. Fished every summer through high school, making decent money for a high school student. But the money was insufficient and too unpredictable to support what college was likely going to cost. And so while going to university, I did alternative work in the summertime as a lineman. That pay was good enough. I was lucky enough to have a little bit of scholarship support, got through university. The simple lesson from that was that the salmon returns that had helped support my family and many other fishing families were no longer sustainable enough to pay for what was then even the modest cost of college. As mentioned, I went to law school here at the University of Washington, and after my second year, I got a job working for the Alaska Commercial Fisheries Entry Commission, helping to develop the regulations. Basically, I was hired as kind of a hearing officer, if you will. And as I'll talk about just briefly later, the law wasn't the most popular item in Alaska. And so an opening as a commissioner came available as I was nearing the end of my 3 months of work there. And it was offered to me, a young 26-year-old kid who never managed anything, really. It shows you how few people were interested in the job. But I took it, and this innovative law was actually one of a multiple-pronged effort to restore Alaska salmon runs. Restricting who could fish, a public resource, was a revolutionary concept at the time, but times were desperate, and rural communities and families were having a difficult time making it up and down the coast of Alaska. Under the new law, there were limits placed on the number of fishing units. Expressed as permits, you had to have a permit in your hand to be on a boat to fish for salmon under this law. And by fixing the number of fishermen, it was hoped that the salmon fisheries would become more manageable. Very controversial law. Another effort implemented to address the problem of low returns was a comprehensive salmon enhancement program. This program focused on hatcheries and habitat restoration. The hatchery efforts created a system of nurseries to increase the winter survival rates for local stocks, and by limiting mortality during the egg, fry, and juvenile life stages, the hatchery program could enhance and fortify the wild spawning stocks. This is a nursery. This is eggs being introduced into a hatchery in Alaska. Hatchery site selection, species, volume of egg take, release sites, were all developed by the Alaska Department of Fish and Game. And it was through a process that was very public and open, where there was a lot of participation by the public to ensure that there was broad input and that all issues were considered before development occurred. Now, a third and very vital effort to rebuild salmon runs was implementation of the Magnuson-Stevens Fishery Management and Conservation Act. That act established jurisdiction over fishing out to 200 miles from the United States. And this brought under control foreign fishing in the Bering Sea by vessels like these. These types of vessels will be somewhere 75 to 100 meters, wouldn't be an unusual length. They fish a long net. They catch whatever salmon happen to be there and anything else that's with them, rather indiscriminate with respect to species, area that they're bound for. It was extremely frustrating to state fisheries managers to have effort out just beyond 12 miles fishing for salmon, when oftentimes they had local salmon fishermen shut down to achieve escapement goals. So this act, the Magnuson-Stevens Act, was critically important to bringing that particular type of fishery under control. And then along with the extension of the U.S. jurisdiction to 200 miles, intensive negotiations about high sea salmon fishing occurred between our governments and those that were engaged in the practice. That would cover the fisheries that were occurring beyond 200 miles, but still focusing on stocks that were of concern and returning to the United States. So, what was the result? Well, the result was of this multi-pronged revival effort has been the largest sustained salmon runs in the recorded history of Alaska. So you can see here kind of what happened. Federal management got its peak, came down, state management began, kind of fumbled along, and then really tough stuff. And right where it says limited entry begins is where the hatchery programs were started, was subsequently later when the Magnuson-Stevens Act was passed. But you can see that there's a fairly constant and higher level of harvest that's been occurring since that period of time. Thanks to all these efforts, fishermen can make a living. Coastal communities can thrive. Now that should all sound good, right? Well, as we will find out later, not so good to some. Let's now take a look at some other U.S. fisheries, very briefly. In my own lifetime, there have been many successes and frankly some spectacular failures. In the latter category, I can think about New England cod. Cape Cod has no cod. The Alaska king crab fishery in the Bering Sea used to have quotas of, Dave, how much? 200 million? You know, huge, right? Now we're lucky to get 10. We didn't know as much then, or if we knew it, we ignored it. But it can be argued that it's too late to reform for those fisheries. We may have taken them down to a stock level, but they'll never get back to where they were historically. Yet even our major success stories are the subject of intense and vocal criticism at times. For the Puget Sound, one very important fishery is conducted in the Bering Sea for pollock. The fishery pollock is conducted by a fleet of very large vessels using modern trawl gear. Our critics like to label it an industrial fishery. Makes it sound like strip mining or something that really needs to be tightly controlled or is out of control. It's industrial fishing. And there is an effort, a large effort, to simply ban it. Greenpeace has been on this campaign for a long, long time to stop factory trawling in the Bering Sea. This pollock fishery, along with other federal fisheries, is managed by the U.S. government under a budget that exceeds $800 million a year. No small amount. The regulators focus not just on harvesting, but on research, habitat, bycatch, enforcement. Management sets the spending priorities in light of complex needs of many different fisheries in both the Atlantic and Pacific sides of America. And it must pay attention to not just commercial fishing, but recreational fishing and subsistence fishing as well. It's a complex job that they have with many different fisheries, gear types, species, landing ports, and a vast coastline. So the regulations establish who can fish, how much can be taken, where one can fish, and with what gear. I want to show you this graph just because it illustrates the pollock fishery in the Bering Sea and how it's been managed over time. Biomass is the measurable biomass that scientists can find in the ocean. OFL is the overfishing limit. If you fish over that amount, then you're endangering and becoming possible to overfish the fishery as it's defined in the Magnuson-Stevens Act. ABC is the allowable biological catch. That is, what percentage of the biomass could you extract and safely assume that you can continue with that biomass over time? TAC is the total allowable catch, and notice it's less than the ABC. And that's because there's a cap in the Bering Sea of 2 million metric tons of all ground fish. And so the fisheries they're not allowed to take the ABC in every case. And at the bottom is the actual catch. I'll try. Remind me though. Okay.
Let's try that.
My wife accuses me of talking so low that I don't want her to hear me. Some of these fellows know my wife. It's probably true. Both federal and Alaska state fisheries regulations are developed with a process in which stakeholder input is involved at multiple stages. In the federal fisheries, it's through the regional council system. In the case of Alaska, it is through the Alaska Board of Fisheries. And we have a former member of the Alaska Board of Fisheries here and a former member of the North Pacific Council here. Thank you for your service. Anyone can make proposals or testify to existing regulations through these bodies. In addition, when regulations are developed to enact council actions, it once again goes through an open process where all stakeholders have an opportunity to comment on the proposed regulations that implement the council rulings. and the government is required to consider and respond to those comments. In the case of the federal regulations, they're based on a number of important pieces of legislation. I mentioned Magnuson-Stevens already. The Marine Mammal Protection Act, the Endangered Species Act come to play, just to name a few. Each of these acts were created through the democratic process. That is, they went through Congress, where there was an open and participatory process where all stakeholders have an opportunity to influence the legislation. They all must also be reauthorized periodically. And during this reauthorization process, there's once again the opportunity to participate and provide input. This is really a critical point. All of what we do flows from these laws in the federal arena. Our democratic process is how we set our national priorities, including how we choose to manage our fisheries and to what purpose. So the groups that can participate includes everybody, as I said, and that includes environmental non-governmental organizations, and I'll use NGO to describe them as a group from here on out, who have much to say and a lot of valuable input with respect to fishing practices. But it's here then that I want to turn the focus of my talk to the role of government and the role of the NGOs in the management of fisheries in the United States. Let me start by saying that there's no denying that there are flaws in our fisheries management system. It is not perfect. There'll never be enough data to understand perfectly what the status of a stock is. Fish are not like cattle, which you can count because you can see them. For fish, we have to use a different set of tools to determine stock strength. We conduct dedicated research surveys. We collect data from observers on vessels. We measure CPUE, catch per unit of effort. And we generate stock biomass estimates through computer modeling. We manage harvest through a system of conservative catch limits or quotas by area. We restrict the amount and nature of the gear used to harvest the fish. And in some cases, we restrict harvest to a certain sex or size. For salmon, we manage by escapement. The goal is to ensure that an adequate number of spawners return to each system to reproduce effectively. So you could say that salmon are regulated by what we don't catch. Escapement comes first, catching the second. We also close large areas to fishing for a variety of different needs. And some of you might have seen this before. This map depicts various parts of the federal waters off the state of Alaska that are closed to either bottom trawling and other gear, state waters closed to bottom trawling, and then actually closed to fishing of any type. And I want to add the Arctic Ocean was recently closed off to commercial fishing by the North Pacific Council, and the NIMS put in a regulation to that effect, simply saying we don't have enough information about this area to allow fishing at this point. We need to study it, gather data before we're going to let you go in there. So it's a lot of areas that trawling in particular cannot access. All these tools, like I said, are not perfect. But when used over time and adjusted as we learn more, the tools get better and managers become more confident in setting sustainable harvest rates. Add in good research science for better understanding of the stock, strict enforcement to ensure the rules are being followed. And we have in the United States a world-class fishery management system. Let me say again, it's not perfect, but it surely is the best that there is. It also needs to be said that commercial fishing has environmental impacts. The minute you start removing fish from the ocean, you're changing it. You're changing the mix of fish that's there. Sometimes there's unintended bycatch complications. In some cases, contact with the bottom is unavoidable. In some cases, there's interaction with other species, non-fish species, marine mammals, birds. These things happen. But responsible management continually works to identify and minimize these impacts while allowing us to harvest surplus fish for food. All human activity has these kinds of impact, whether it's in the water or on land. Responsible managers of these activities continually monitor and balance the impacts against the benefits from harvesting fish from the ocean. Critics of our management systems tend to come from two camps in my experience. This is just me, maybe different. But one camp will argue the need for more data in order to allow fishing. If you don't or can't know something for sure, then be precautionary and don't fish at all or fish a lot less. It's called a precautionary principle, but it's driven by the data that in many cases you can't get. I'll use the salmon example on this one. Many groups lobby for what is called discrete stock salmon fishing. Because in many ocean and near-shore salmon fisheries, you cannot know for certain exactly what stock is being taken at any one time. Hence, if you focus on discrete stocks, you allow fishing only when you know exactly what the stock composition is of the catch, and therefore you delay harvest until you get to a point where they are sorted out, which in the case of most salmon means you're up the river somewhere. Not going to catch a lot of fish up there. Another example is the current effort to close the Bering Sea canyons to all fishing on the premise that there might be a unique habitat affected by fishing in that area. That's a case where we say we don't have the data, we're worried about it, don't fish there. The second group that criticizes management, in my view, tends to be a bit more ideological in nature. An example of this is the Save the Whales program. I use whales for this example perhaps a bit provocatively, because not many of us think of whales as food, when in fact historically it was just that. I'll digress for a minute. When I was a youngster, I got to go to Barrow and spent a month up there with high school classmates, and they were whaling at the time. And I can guarantee you that the Inupiats believe that whale are food and cultural necessities. But that's a digression. I don't think we're going to change the whaling thing anytime soon. In this kind of ideological approach, the position taken is that no stock of whales can absorb or be subject to any harvest of any kind because they're whales. In the current fisheries world, a similar campaign, as we've talked about, would ban all trawling, or at least the portion that's considered to be bottom trawling or factory trawling. And by the way, there's no doubt that we beat whale populations down to a level where they needed to be protected. That's not my point. But it is an example of that kind of approach. In the case of either one of these types of groups, the process of fishery regulation in the U.S., as I mentioned already, gives each group an opportunity to alter management, to change management, by demonstrating why rules should be changed to become more precautionary approach, or to actually to ban fishing in a particular area for a particular species. So what happens when a well-meaning and well-funded NGO group is unable to get the change that they want through an open science-based process? But they don't want to give up. They have a mission. What alternatives do they have? Well, first, they can do what any U.S. citizen can do. They can sue the government. They can charge them that they weren't following the process that they were supposed to follow, or that they violated the law that governed their actions, that it didn't follow the national standards of the Magnuson Act, for example. And this judicial process is one that groups have used, and when the government has erred, the courts have required the government to correct the actions. But what if the NGOs feel that this is too costly, too slow, unachievable, the case isn't strong enough maybe? What do they do then? A recent tactic is to make an end run around the scientific and democratic process that we have and try to effect fishery change by applying force to the marketplace. Sometimes by lobbying those who own and manage retail stores and restaurants, and or by taking their message directly to consumers. And here's an attack on Costco, ocean destruction, you have fish that aren't in your store that are sustainable, boycott Costco, that's the message. Now, as we all know, the NGO community isn't homogenous. I've had some funny conversations with folks that work for, I'll call it NGO Group A, who talk about those guys over in Group B that are just hotheads and they don't know what they're doing. And then you go talk to the hotheads and they're just really upset with the first group because they're not doing enough to make some change. So they're not homogenous. But it's also apparent that the more extreme group's agenda can, over time, become mainstream if those who fund the efforts continue to support the cause. But whatever their orientation, NGO groups have learned that the market can be a powerful tool to achieve change that could not be achieved in a forum of fishery managers or even a court of law. Pardon me for a second. So, when I talk about market, what do I mean by that? What is the market in the context of this effort to change fisheries management? I define the market in this context as those purveyors of seafood to consumers who are concerned about their image in the eyes of their customers. Any company with equity in its brand is vulnerable to any NGO that can bring negative publicity to it. Any company would cringe over a banner dropped in front of their store screaming, "Brand X store kills dolphins." That'd be a tough one, wouldn't it? And urging a boycott because they carry a brand of canned tuna that is not, quote, certified as dolphin safe. Remember, the boycott affects the entire store, not just the tuna aisle. And if consumers are driven away from one store's parking lot by banners, protesters fearing guilt, justified or not, they'll take all their business away from the store, not just the tuna business. With so much business at risk, a targeted store, like Costco, is not going to jeopardize its customer base over a small tuna supplier who could not afford to demonstrate dolphin safe. So the seafood buyer for Brand X, he gets a call from the CEO saying, "Make this problem go away." Shortly afterwards, he's probably relegated to be the greeter at the store, which is one notch below being a seafood buyer. But he has to make the problem go away. He has to say to them, "We have no room for you. Bye-bye, Brand Y tuna." What the NGO hopes is that the back pressure from the market will compel the targeted tuna supplier to change its ways. There might even be a friendly NGO available that would volunteer to help the industry fix the problem. I use volunteer a little bit loosely because volunteering in this case always comes with a price. The dolphin example, from my perspective, comes from the ideological bent that no activity should ever occur that might cause some problems for dolphins. And again, that's okay. They're very cute, and we don't want to harm them. So the CEO of the store is musing, why do I have all this trouble in the seafood department? I mean, I've got chicken and beef and pork and paper towels and detergents. I don't have banners off of my store for those. Why seafood? Well, the answer is not simple, but in a way it's very simple. When we sell beef or chicken, we label it beef is beef, chicken is chicken, and if we want to highlight something special about it, we might call it cage-free chicken or black Angus beef. But it's still beef and chicken. That's what it is. None of it is wild capture, so the rules of growing and bringing these proteins to market are far less complicated than they are for seafood. But if you think about it, we don't sell seafood. We don't. We sell Gulf shrimp, Dungeness crab, Maine lobster, Alaska pollock, yellow eye, Alaska salmon. I could go on forever. We don't have enough time for that. But I think the point is the simple one, that seafood compared to these other proteins is a pretty complicated space for that seafood buyer. He's got a pretty tough job compared to the guy that's buying beef. How in the heck could that seafood buyer have ever known that tuna that he was buying was not dolphin safe? He's got over 200 SKUs that he has to worry about. It's just very complicated. But our NGO friends have come up with a solution. Why don't you hire us to advise you on your buying policies? We will make sure you don't get a banner on your building, but if you do, we can be your shield. Just follow our advice. And so we've had a lot of groups that have entered this space to provide advice. And this more or less represents mostly the wild side. We could go to the aquaculture side and there'd be another full page of things. And I'm sure I haven't captured them all here. And so, over the past 2 decades, really, we've had a vast network that have provided many ways for a buyer of seafood to know what the store was carrying and whether it was safe. This network includes, I call them bolt-on businesses to establish enterprises. An example of that is Monterey Bay Aquarium that developed its Seafood Watch program. They were an aquarium first and then became experts on advising folks on what's sustainable and what's not. In the latter category of startups with more focused missions, we've got entities like SFP, Sustainable Fisheries Partnership, and MSC, the Marine Stewardship Council. And I don't want to pick on them, but I'll use those two as surrogates for these types of NGOs that were created with a focused mission to advise folks on what kind of seafood policy they should have in their procurement divisions. Now, for those of you not familiar with it, SFP, Sustainable Fisheries Partnership, has been very successful. It's enlisted many high-profile brands as customers. They include McDonald's, Publix, Walt Disney is this, okay, Walmart, and Nestle, among over 40 large branded companies that seek advice on their procurement policies from SFP. Pretty powerful force in the marketplace. SFP reviews public documents about fisheries management and decides whether the fishery is suitable for its partners. SFP also created FIPS, FIPS, Fishery Improvement Projects, to help a fishery improve and become more sustainable. And part of SFP's advice to its partners was that if a fishery was engaged in a responsible FIP, which by definition it's were, then it was okay to source from it, even though it may not currently be sustainable. This is that volunteer effort to help fix problems. I'm guessing you are all familiar with the Marine Stewardship Council. Mr. Coe was here last week. Very articulate gentleman. While there are many similar entities to MSC, MSC clearly dominates the space for organizations, or as they are described in their home base in the UK as schemes, that independently certify whether a wild capture fishery is sustainably managed or not. MSC does not explicitly engage in a partnership with seafood buyers, but it does encourage exclusivity and provides high-profile recognition for those that commit to using only MSC-certified fish. Unlike SFP, MSC establishes its standard in a process that is open to stakeholders from the seafood industry, though in the end, the standards for both groups are private in nature. Both SFP and MSC are useful to other entities in the NGO community that hope to drive change in fisheries management that they have been unable to achieve through the regulatory process or the courts. And both have funders that are common to some of these NGOs, funders who look for coordination in policy and strategy. Now, I want to say again that fisheries management is not perfect. Fishing comes with environmental impacts, and NGOs, including the efforts of SFP and MSC and their like, have helped to achieve improvements in some fisheries where responsible management did not exist. But we must understand that using the marketplace to achieve changes that the law and sound science would not require comes with consequences. Probably too many to list, but there are 3 that I want to mention. The first is, if you're not certified, you get a lower price for your fish. You get less money. The second is, you may shift harvest patterns with unintended consequences. The third is the failure to harvest surplus stocks. I'll talk about each of these very briefly next. Lower price for fish. This happens when a higher end market stops buying fish from a fishery because it cannot afford to be certified or it is under NGO pressure. The fish often are still caught, they just go into a lower value market. Now, if you want a fishery to improve, taking money away from it hardly seems to be the right path, particularly for fisheries in developing countries with little surplus to begin with. But it is true there remain large markets in the world that do not require proof of sustainability. Shifting harvest with unintended consequences. Forced market-driven changes may compel a fishery to avoid certain productive areas, for example, moving them into areas with greater bycatch or higher costs due to lower catch rates. And as the news tightens on fishing effort for non-scientific reasons, we will surely be forced to leave a growing percentage of surplus fish in the water unharvested. And this is a segue into what I call the biggie of these three consequences. This is a world population map that's a little outdated. We're butting right up to 7 million, or billion people now. A lot of people to feed. Failure to harvest surplus fish. So why does it matter to leave fish unharvested that can be taken? 1 in every 7 of those people use seafood as their primary source of protein. 1 in every 7. Food nutrition affects health in the most fundamental way. The United Nations has developed the FAO, Food, that's the F, and Agriculture Organization, because it recognizes that food security is at the heart of world peace. Without food, bad things happen. How can we expect starving populations to protect the environment? What is the environmental cost of malnutrition and famine? You don't see many headlines about that, but my guess is the environmental impact is huge when people don't have enough food. They won't care if it's the last fish in the pond, if they're hungry. The use of trawl gear as a primary method of harvesting fish, particularly so-called ground fish around the world, is controversial, as I've mentioned, and it's not in favor among some NGO groups that are working hard to ban its use. First in places like the deep water, high seas fisheries, but in the end, they really want to see it banned altogether. So what if we ban trawling in our oceans? What method of gear could take its place? I can't think of any gear that could take the place of the trawls that we use for harvesting our Bering Sea pollock. Our current quota in that fishery is 1.3 million metric tons. And if I've done the math right, I think that's about 260 million individual fish that are being caught. How would you propose to catch that many individual fish if you weren't using a trawl? It's very likely, in fact, I think it's certain, that we would have to leave some fish in the water and substitute a different kind of protein for those fish. What would that protein be? Soy, corn, beef, chicken? I mean, what would it be? What resources would it take to grow those resources, those alternative proteins? How many square miles of rainforest would have to be cut down to produce them? I'm sure Dr. Hilbert knows the answer to that question, but I don't. But let's just say it's likely that it's an environmentally enormous amount. So I'm going to jump around on you and go back to Alaska for a few minutes. I mentioned earlier that Alaska's efforts to restore its salmon runs included a comprehensive salmon enhancement effort, mostly for pink and chum salmon, but there are programs for other species as well. These programs have had a variability of success, but for the most part, the gross volume of salmon from the combined wild donor stocks and the enhanced fish significantly exceed the volume that the wild stock alone provided, even in its peak years. Here's a seiner catching pink salmon in Prince William Sound. It was taken in 2013 when we had a very large run. There are many critics of the hatchery programs, including some well-respected scientists. In early 2013, when a former Alaska Department of Fish and Game employee was telling the Wild Salmon Center that Alaska's hatchery program was severely flawed and destroying wild stocks, he failed to anticipate a few months later that we would have a record wild salmon harvest of pink salmon in Prince William Sound and a record enhanced pink salmon harvest in Prince William Sound that summer. This guy was the lucky one fishing there. Here's a picture of the pink salmon production in Prince William Sound over time, wild and harvest. So what are the concerns about these enhanced fish? Why is it not a good thing to produce more fish? Some say we are stretching the carrying capacity of the oceans. Russia and Japan both have large hatchery programs along with Alaska. Some say that we are causing genetic harm to wild stocks. Some say that the salmon are outcompeting forage fish in the ocean that are important to other predator stocks. There are those that say that enhanced pink salmon in particular outcompete sockeye in the ocean to their detriment. Ironically, There was a very large sockeye return to Bristol Bay in 2014, and an even larger one predicted for 2015. And those sockeye were in the ocean at the same time as these 2013 pink salmon were there. I'm not a scientist, but they seem to be doing pretty good. There are, of course, many studies of the effects of hatchery fish on wild fish in Washington, Oregon, and California, where wild stocks struggle to survive habitat destruction and dams. But very little study has been done on the Alaska program other than documenting the straying of enhanced fish into some streams and mixing with wild stocks. Because of the controversy surrounding the program, Alaska recently started an extensive research program to better understand the interaction of wild and enhanced salmon. The first 2 years of the study focused on comprehensive sampling of fish to document the extent of straying. That work will continue for many years, while attention will also turn to genetic analysis to determine if there is a trend towards divergence between wild and enhanced, and whether, if there is divergence, it is causing harm to the wild stocks. The results of the study won't begin to be useful for management for several years, but Alaska will stand by its pledge that wild salmon come first. And if the results show that they need to make corrections to the program, they're committed to doing it. I go into this little bit of detail because despite that effort, which is costing about $1.5 million a year, despite that effort, many NGO groups critical of the Alaska program take the position that these enhancement programs should be curtailed as a precaution now. In fact, the auditors for the MSC program do not believe that the Prince William Sound pink salmon fishery is sustainably managed based on its standard and because of the hatchery program. And yes, that's the fishery that had this record run in 2013. Not a bad one in 2014 either. Nevertheless, Prince William Sound pink salmon now are not MSC certified, and so SFP and MSC and similar groups basically have to call for a boycott of that fishery. Go to restaurants, go to retailers, and tell them consumers should not buy pink salmon from Prince William Sound. What an irony. Record returns, but not sustainable. All of which is to say that an NGO group can cause a boycott of a fishery that seems very healthy, and they probably have a lot of power to force change in fisheries that are not. I think our world's going to look something like that in about 50 years. It's going to be very crowded. I hope for good intentions from the NGO community. I've worked with a number of them over the years. But I also go back to the challenge we face as the world population grows from 7 billion to 10 billion over the next 50 years. How will we feed them? We must, of course, responsibly manage our fisheries, but in my book, that includes management for optimum yield so that we can continue to efficiently harvest whatever seafood we can to support this inevitably more crowded planet. So when you hear a chorus to shut down a fishery, let's at least have a reasonable debate about the facts and include in that debate what we propose to feed people if we turn the ocean into an aquarium. On the right is a federal fisheries observer, very common in Alaska. They do research on board vessels as catches coming in, monitor bycatch, looking for age data, size at age, that kind of stuff. He's a scientist. But we have this. So fisheries management must be science-based. In my opinion, it cannot regulate based upon emotion or pressure. If we follow the science, sustainability and healthy food from the ocean will follow. Thank you. I just want to add that I realize this position is probably contrarian to a lot of folks that you might hear from, and I don't mind being challenged. There's definitely a lot of room for debate here. So, questions?
What do you see as the role of the NGO? I mean, ultimately, we're all the public, and we all have opinions. Some of those opinions will differ radically across this world. We have
I think that they're playing the type of role that's actually very helpful. You know, we had lots of fishery problems in the United States. You saw it on the salmon graph, and there's other problems that exist. So they play a legitimate role. The question is, how do we ensure that we don't arrive at a space where we can't harvest fish that should legitimately be harvested, that we need to feed people? And so I don't know what the answer is. I think dialogue between the NGOs and the fishing community is imperative and to continue. But the tactic, if you will, of using the marketplace is something that is, in my mind, very harmful to what our mission is, which is to feed people. So yes, they play a legitimate role, but I would like to work with retailers and food service companies so that they don't feel bound to follow exactly what a radical NGO group might demand of them, and embrace the science that we use in our federal fisheries, and in my opinion, in Alaska, that demonstrates that we're doing things the right way. That should be their shield. Up front?
I see the NGOs as the other side of the coin from industry. The industry is doing its best to convince us through the marketplace what we should buy and how we should use our power of our purse. How are these two different?
I don't think they're necessarily that different, but remember, we can only sell what we're allowed to catch. And so if we're getting fish out of, you know, responsibly managed fisheries, then we're not, we presume we're not doing harm to the stocks. Follow? Okay. Back there?
Thanks. So I guess I would consider this sort of idea of the agreements there, where they are explicitly saying don't.
Mm-hmm.
And sort of playing that with NPFMC that are, because I've never experienced it, don't need that, it's been explicitly expressed. And I'm wondering if you could provide maybe a little bit more context of situations where you think that the NPFMC are saying don't need this particular requirement.
Yeah, MSC's message is that if you buy a fish that's MSC certified, then you'll know that it's sustainably managed. If you buy a fish that isn't certified by us, then you have no assurance that it's sustainably managed at all. So it's sort of an indirect way of saying that only buy our fish, and that really is the message that they put out there. SFP is an organization that is a little bit harder to mine into because it's not as transparent as MSC is. But they definitely have a message that they convey about what's acceptable under their standards and not. And I'll mention some pink salmon is a good example of that. They advise their partners to avoid prince William salmon. Don't buy it. And so they each play a role like that. And again, that space is there because seafood is very complicated. And I've just talked about U.S. fisheries in Alaska, right? But let's talk about the Indian Ocean and what kind of problems you might see coming out of there. There's a great space there for the NGO community to help mine those things. Costco's stance, unless they've changed it in the last few days, has been that within the U.S., they're going to make their decision about what's sustainable or not. They're not going to rely on what a partner might tell them. But outside of the U.S., they want a third-party certifier to help them be sure that the shrimp that they're getting out of that farm is a sustainably managed farm, or the cod from the Atlantic Ocean is one that's sustainably managed. And so they've got a bifurcated policy. So they're going to rely on that. It's a good role for them. I don't know if that helps, but.
All the surveys I've ever seen suggest that a very small fraction of consumers, usually less than 10%, base their buying decisions on sustainability. They're much more interested in food safety and price as we're producing, given as and so and if they look at MSC, I don't know what is it, 8% of fish production is certified. I mean, it seems
Well, my friends at MSC will disagree with what I'm about to say, and you won't be surprised by that. But they can affect things the best when they have the world's most popular fisheries under their tent. They can build their brand and become stronger when they've got sort of the modern westernized world with them. And so I think the focus was very deliberate, and we need to establish a base. Let's do it with these most popular fisheries that people will recognize, that are iconic, that are part of the Western world where our funding base is. Will they, over time, start shifting? I think some of the NGO groups really have started focusing on some of those areas. There's been a lot of effort in Eastern Russia by some of the West Coast groups, both for pollock and for salmon in particular, a little bit of cod, to help them modernize their fisheries. But if the fish that we're targeting is caught off the coast of India and consumed in India, I think it's a long time before MSC is going to put any money there. If the fish caught in India is processed and comes to the United States, maybe there's going to be a bit of a focus. Come on.
So if the opportunity for the NGOs to have presence for fisheries were in areas where management systems lack credibility and probably because European U.S. management system should inherently have that credibility. I'm interested in what your perspective is. Why have, and if the arena is naturally for the retailers and not the consumers, where I think we all agree that's where the fight occurs. How have the NGOs been able to convince the retailers that the U.S. system doesn't have the credibility that it should have?
Well-funded and smart. Let's start with that. I think I'll go back to how complicated seafood is. And I've seen, I've dealt with a lot of buyers over the years, and you could just see their eyes glaze over when you start talking about sustainability, and they've got all of these different products in the store. And, well, I think these are from the U.S. because it says made in USA, but they didn't realize it was actually started out in China, of a Russian product that came over here and then was chopped up into pieces and breaded. So it's just confusing for them. So that's a major problem. And then my sense of customers, and Ray was sort of alluding to this, I think, consumers, is that they don't want to know all this stuff. What they want to do is to trust the brand that they're buying from. And so when I go shop at Safeway or QFC, Thriftway in my neighborhood, I'm walking in trusting that these guys are doing the right thing. They get nervous when the NGOs are after them because it's that trust that brings me into that store. And so I think they would love to be able to say, we embrace U.S. fisheries, they're in our store, it's just fine. But there's a whole bunch of folks out there whispering in their ear that it's not. And they're put in a hard spot. I don't know if that answers the question or bounces around. Sir? Oh.
Let's go Jeff Bullock, MSC. Given 95% of the talk, actually, I have to say, about 95% of our talk said I completely agree with you. And I should put on a few topics. But the community stuff is I have to say, is as maddening. Maybe it's not as maddening, it's almost as maddening to us as it is to the industry. And what was certified? We spend so
We've had a few debates.
But I think there's this incredibly complex, it's frustrating for someone who's in this region that so many NGOs focus so much energy on the best fishery. Right? I mean, without a doubt, we suffer from that every day. And I think that this gets really, MSC's view, I think, or the Croatia was like any other organization, which is what do you need to be successful? To a certain extent, you need critical mass. And working with larger fisheries and successful fisheries is going to get you on the map, and that's going to get you inroads into the more challenging ones. And I think we've seen, John started off by talking about tuna, right? Mexican yellowfin tuna fisheries under MSC assessment. That's the one that's the poster child for profound institute, dolphin safe, threats, et cetera. And so I think that the only investment I would say is the critical mass approach is really, and this is the same for Trident, North Pacific, or any large company, is really what gets you into the relevant in the discussion. And hopefully to allow you to enter areas, at least in our domain, that are more challenging. But John, maybe 98% of what you said. Now, what you said, obviously much louder because I'm louder.
I must have misspoken. Mark?
Is there anything that government should be doing inherently now in terms of, when you say that these are responsible agencies by the U.S. government, should they have a deal with MSC?
Well, yeah, that's been a topic of great debate, as you can imagine. You know, we've asked, you know, NOAA, National Marine Fisheries Service, to put more effort into publicizing what you're doing and defending your fisheries. And the pushback is, okay, we'll take some dollars out of this research project and put it over here, and yeah, and then that fishery's got a little problem. Maybe we won't fish there, or won't fish as much. It's a scarcity of dollars problem. There's a proposal out there for the U.S. government to start its own certification system. And from my perspective, I say, well, that's the government certifying itself. That's really, you know, that's a problem. And so, yes, it could do more. There's no question about it. But it's difficult given the scarce resources that we have. Yes?
I, like Jeff, am a member of the NGO community as well. And one thing I want to point out is that if you look at like Monterey Bay Aquarium and their slew of ratings, very few of those ratings are for the U.S. are actually red. They're mostly green and yellow. And so when you're looking at those kind of buyer partnerships, like FSP has, Fishwise and things like that, they're the bulk of what they're working on isn't helping buyers adjust their sourcing within the United States. It is really focusing on things like Jeff said, like yellowfin, tuna, and other pelagics that they're really looking to replace. So I think that there's kind of a little bit of misinformation out there that some of the NGOs are very extreme, and it is frustrating to get jumbled all together. But I think that if you're looking at this, we're really working with retailers. They are focusing away from U.S. fisheries and on more international.
Yeah, Monterey Bay is also doing consumer facing, and so they got a program going there. I know that the Alaska pollock folks take a little umbrage about the rating that they have and can't figure out how to get inside the tent and have a reasonable discussion with them about that, because Alaska pollock is rated yellow, and I go back to that fishery and look at the productivity of it over time, the way it's managed. It should be a green. So. Well, just a little bit of the history maybe. I think MSC's worked real hard to try to restore relationships with the group that you're talking about, the salmon processors that dropped out. Rupert has reached out to me many times, and Jeff has, and we've had a lot of conversations about this. But, you know, every 5 years or so, MSC is going to go through and review its standard, make adjustments in light of whatever has gone on in the 5 years. And usually that means a higher bar. It's not a lower bar. And so with a higher bar, then you face the possibility, like we did, of a fishery that was certified, in the case of the salmon fishery that you're referring to, for 10 years, not being certified. And, you know, I believe strongly in continuous improvement in fisheries management. And the way that you do that is you require managers to take into consideration all new information and make decisions with that in mind. In my mind, that's different than raising the bar all the time to force continuous improvement in that way. It's a slightly different thing. Yeah. I misunderstood. I thought you meant the trust between MSC and the certification unit. You mean between me as a producer and my customers? Yeah. Well, you know, yeah. When companies chose to get out of the program for salmon, they obviously gave up the logo, and they faced the challenge of convincing people, their customers, that you could trust this fish. I always found it a bit ironic because really the difference is the chain of custody. The fishery in Bristol Bay is certified by MSC. I buy a lot of fish in Bristol Bay. I'm not MSC. My competitor is MSC and has MSC fish for sale. Some customers are only going to buy that MSC fish. Our job is to convince the customer that there's no difference between our fish. They can trust what we're doing. We didn't substitute Russian sockeye. And that's just the relationship that we have to develop and try to maintain. But MSC has been very successful in convincing some major customers around the world that if it doesn't have either the logo or the chain of custody, then you can't trust it.